Hey folks, we are on video 2. We are talking about the second agricultural revolution. We're going to continue to talk about subsistence farming and different types of agriculture. So you should take a second to set up your notes like so. The first thing we're going to talk about is we're going to continue our conversation about subsistence farming today. And so remember, we previously talked about shifting cultivation as a way of subsistence farming. Remember, it had two distinctive features: slash and burn agricultural methods, and it could only be used, each plot of land, or what's called as a swidden, can only be used for 3 years or less because they rapidly lose their fertility after the first years of cultivation. So remember, it takes about 6 to 20 years for those plots to regain their fertility. Okay, so after that quick review, the next type of subsistence farming that we need to talk about is pastoral nomadism. And this is when people herd domesticated animals. Some examples could be like cattle, horses, sheep, goats, camels. And this is practiced in semi-arid climates. And so this is kind of almost like desert regions. So there are small amounts of rainfall but really high temperatures. And the reason why most people have turned to pastoral nomadism here is because plants don't grow well in these regions. And sometimes they're also kind of mountainous, and you need some flat, arable land if you want to grow crops. So places where these can be found are Central Asia, Turkmenistan, the Gobi Desert, the Sahara Desert in Africa, and you can see here, remember the Maasai people, this stateless nation that we learned about in political geography. They're pastoral nomads. And then we also see large swaths of the Middle East, so like Saudi Arabia, Iran, Iraq, Egypt, and Syria. And I do want to point out that some of this extends into China as well. So these people are not sedentary. They do not stay in the same place. There's about 15 million people who practice pastoral nomadism in the world, and they take up about 20% of the Earth's total surface. And they do need crops at some point. They don't just live off of their domesticated animals, so they exchange animal products for crops. So we see a lot of trade-offs happening. But their movements are not random. They do have a sense of territoriality, remember, so that's some type of control of the land. And they do practice transhumance oftentimes. And remember, that's the seasonal migration of livestock between mountains in the summer months and pastures during the winter months. So movement of your herd with the seasons. Pastoral nomadism is extensive. You need to know that term, extensive. Herders are really searching for land all of the time because they're trying to feed their livestock. So what makes it extensive is that it covers a wide swath of land. There is a large amount of land used in pastoral nomadism. However, in the current day, we've seen government efforts really try to settle these pastoral nomads, and so we see the rapid decline of people who practice this. And these governments are trying to settle these nomads because they want to use the land for other purposes. They don't want it to be used for livestock grazing. So places like China, Kazakhstan, Egypt, Israel, Saudi Arabia, and Syria have really cracked down on the ability of pastoral nomads to really roam like they once were able to. Okay, so the next type of subsistence agriculture is intensive wet rice. This is an intensive form of agriculture, which means that a very small amount of land is used and there's a very high yield of the crops. So in Southeast Asia, including China, so you can see Southeast Asia, East Asia is very prominent in wet rice production. And the term wet rice refers to the practice of planting rice in a dry land. So at first it's planted in a dry land, and in a nursery oftentimes. And then those seeds are picked up and moved to flooded fields, which then helps the rice grow. So you can see examples of those flooded fields in these photos. So wet rice is most easily grown on flat land because the plants are completely submerged in the water. And so this is why a lot of wet rice cultivation takes place in river valleys and deltas. So when the river floods, that's beneficial to the rice production. And in India, where rice production you can see along the coasts are prominent, the monsoons that come provide the floods for that rice to grow. So the places where rice are grown, so the flooded fields, are called rice paddies. And many of these rice paddies in Southeast Asia and southern China are built on the sides of hills. So you can see that right here and here. And these hills are terraced, and that's what these kind of notches in the hill are. It's called terracing. And this is a physical alteration to the landscape that allows water to gently flow over the edges of each paddy onto the one below it. And so the purpose is that water distribution goes downhill and that this water can move and completely submerge the rice in all of these different terraces. This is really how people can alter their environment to make it more beneficial for them. So the agricultural density of wet rice productive regions, which remember is the ratio of farmers to arable land, is so high in Asia that families must produce enough food for their survival from a very small area of land. This is a contributing cause to soil degradation, but one benefit is that they waste nothing. So paths and roads are kept as narrow as possible to minimize the loss of that arable land. Okay, so let's talk about the Second Agricultural Revolution. So the Second Agricultural Revolution starts in the 1600s and it goes until about the 1700s. It coincides with the Industrial Revolution, and this takes place in Great Britain or England, and it spreads to Western Europe. So this, although it's recorded as being from the 1600s to the 1700s, it continues all the way through the mid-1900s, and it radically alters the global geography of agriculture. So remember the spatial perspective. Where are things at and why are they there? So what was the Second Agricultural Revolution? It used the technology from the Industrial Revolution as a means to increase agricultural production and distribution. So it's a cause of the Industrial Revolution, but it's also a result. So they kind of work together. So increased yields per acre and per farmer move people beyond subsistence farming, and they are able to start selling their crops for a profit. And it really helps feed these growing populations that we see in new urban cities. So remember, urbanization happens during the Industrial Revolution. People move from the farm to the cities to work in these new factories. And so this increased yield in crops helps feed the people who are living in those cities now. Today, many least developed countries or developing countries are still in what we would consider the agricultural revolution. So some key features. Phase one is pre-machinery, which is what these images are you're looking at now. So remember that Britain's Enclosure Act led to the consolidation of small farms into large parcels. So you are replacing the family-owned farm with something larger that more resembles a commercial farm. And this forced millions of people to migrate from those rural farms into those urban cities looking for jobs. When they arrived in those urban cities and when urbanization began, this created an enormous new market for agricultural products. So on these larger farms, there were higher yields because a few things. First of all, they started using crop rotation, which is illustrated here. And all that you need to know about crop rotation is that each field is used for something different every single year. And that way it helps keep the soil healthy. They increased their use of fertilizers. They improved collars, which allowed animals to pull heavier plows. And so you can see an example of one of those heavy plows here. And lastly, they started feeding artificial feed to livestock, which helped them produce more food in the long run because they didn't have to give it to their animals. There is a second phase. This second phase is from the 1800s to the early 1900s, and this is the mechanization phase. So this is when we start to really use high-tech machinery. These machines start replacing humans and also start increasing output. So first, the first invention is the seed drill, and really all you need to know about that is it's a mechanical tool that allowed farmers to plant in rows more easily and to plant their seeds quicker. Then we see the emergence of tractors, reapers, threshers. So there are tons of new agricultural inventions in this second phase. And one of the really important inventions is the steam engine. The steam engine was invented in the late 1700s, and it was soon put into railroads, which then increased the amount of transportation that was available for farmers. And so it made it easier and less expensive to sell their goods on a market. So farmers could ship their products further at a lower cost. And these technological advances also included things like refrigerated boxcars. And this is particularly important because then farmers can start shipping great distances. They don't have to be right next to the market in which they're selling. So this increased productivity requires a new market to handle all of these new crops. And so goods, since they're being shipped further to further regions more quickly, we see the broader sale of agriculture. And so this is really the birth of commercial agriculture. Don't forget that ships are also gaining speed during this time, trains are becoming more reliable, and canals are being built as well. So all of these things contribute to farmers being able to sell their products more readily. The huge significance here, the most important part is with increased agricultural output, we can sustain a larger urban population. And then, here's the kicker, we see the rise of secondary economies. And remember, secondary economic activities are where we see the production and processing of goods. And so we have a new market thanks to the second agricultural revolution. Some other effects is that with higher yields, we see surpluses and then population growth. So don't forget about the DTM here. And so the second agricultural revolution moves our society, or the Society of Great Britain, from stage 1 in the DTM to stage 2. We see more dense and more urban populations over time, and we see more money being spent on agricultural products. This means that it is more capital intensive. With more farmers moving to the cities to work in the factories, we see a rise in the GDP in the countries that experience this revolution. However, there are some negative effects like a broader range of inequality created between the classes and more negative environmental problems like water and air pollution. Okay, so categories of agriculture. We've talked about these briefly, but not in depth. So intensive agriculture is a form where yields are really high. However, there is not a lot of land being cultivated. So small land, high output. Examples of this are like agribusiness and commercial agriculture, as well as like wet rice subsistence that we just talked about. Extensive agriculture is a system characterized by low inputs of labor per unit area. So we have a lot of land, like we see in like livestock ranching or pastoralism, but there are not as many people working. Labor intensive is when we see large levels of manual labor, and capital intensive uses mechanization, machinery, vehicles, and all of this contributes to a large amount of goods being produced with little human labor. So an example of capital intensive would be like wheat and dairy farming. Commercial and subsistence we talked about. I just need you to remember that those are competing forms of agriculture. And last is sedentary versus nomadic. So sedentary is when the farmer remains settled in one place, and nomadic is when people are moving from place to place, like pastoral nomadism and hunter and gatherers.